The glass counter was cold under her hands. Elise Vander had rehearsed this moment 100 times, on the drive over, in the parking lot, standing outside the door for 4 full minutes before she could make herself push it open. She had told herself it was just stuff, objects. She had told herself that a piece of fabric with a unit insignia didn't make her who she was, and that a handful of coins engraved with Latin mottos weren't worth starving over. She had almost believed it. The pawn shop on 4th Street in Duluth smelled like dust and old motor oil, the kind of smell that suggested everything inside it had once mattered to somebody. A glass display case ran the length of the back wall, lit from underneath, filled with watches and rings and a few guns. A tinsel wreath that hadn't been taken down since December hung crooked above the register. The owner, a heavy-set man in a flannel shirt whose name tag read Gillen, was halfway through a sandwich when she walked in. She placed the items on the counter one at a time. 4 challenge coins. Her 68th Medical Brigade patch still sewn to its backing. The deployment ribbon from her second tour, the one that covered the winter in Kunar Province. And the small bronze medallion, an Army Commendation Medal with a V device that her commanding officer had pressed into her palm in a field tent while mortar rounds were still echoing off the hills 2 miles east. Glenn set down his sandwich. He picked up the bronze medallion, turned it over, looked at her, said nothing. "I'm looking to get whatever you can offer," Elise said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Cash today." She had $83 in her checking account. Rent was due in 3 days, $740 for the studio apartment she'd moved into after everything fell apart. She had a half bag of rice, a carton of eggs, and a jar of peanut butter in her kitchen. She had not eaten a full meal in 4 days, which she was trying not to think about. She had also not been to work in 7 months, because 7 months ago, the Minnesota Board of Nursing had suspended her license pending investigation, and without a license, no hospital would touch her. Glenn was still holding the medallion. His face was unreadable. That was when the dog appeared. She hadn't noticed the man in the back of the shop. He'd been standing near the rifle case with a Belgian Malinois on a short lead, waiting to have something appraised. The dog was dark-coated, compact, fitted with a tactical harness that said nothing beyond the obvious. This was not a pet. This was a working dog, or had been one, the kind that went in first and came out last, the kind trained to find what people tried to hide. The dog's name was Vesper. His handler was a man named Roland Cray, 41 years old, recently retired after 17 years as an Army K-9 handler. He now ran a small private investigation firm out of a rented office on Superior Street, which mostly meant he spent his days tracking insurance fraud and conducting the occasional background check, with Vesper sleeping under the desk. Vesper was not sleeping now. At some point in the last 30 seconds, Roland couldn't have said exactly when. The dog had locked onto the counter where Elise was standing. Not at Elise. At the items on the glass. His ears were forward, his body low and still, the posture that Roland had spent years learning to read. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't alertness to a threat. It was something Roland had only seen the dog do a handful of times, always toward other veterans, always in moments the dog had no business understanding. Recognition, that was the only word Roland had ever found for it. Vesper pulled toward the counter. Roland let the lead lengthen. He watched the dog approach, slow and deliberate, and lay his front paws up on the glass case, his muzzle coming to rest directly over the Army Commendation Medal. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply pressed his chest against the counter and stayed there, like he was guarding something. Glenn blinked. He does that a lot. No, Roland said, he doesn't. Elise looked at the dog. The dog looked at her items. She felt something shift in her chest, not quite a break, more like a hairline crack in something she'd been holding very carefully together for a long time. "I'm sorry," she said. Could you please move him? I just need to." "What unit?" Roland asked. He was looking at the patch. The 68th Medical Brigade insignia. His voice wasn't rude, just direct, the way people talk when they aren't in the habit of small talk. Elise looked up. She took in the straight posture, the haircut, the way he stood, weight balanced, hands loose. She recognized it because she had carried it herself once. 68th Med Brigade, she said. Why? "I did 2 rotations out of Bagram when the 68th was there." 2018 and 2019. She had been there in 2019. He didn't push on that. He looked at the medallion again, the V device catching the fluorescent light. V for valor. For something that happened on a hillside in November, with a medevac that couldn't land, and 4 soldiers bleeding in the dirt, and a then 26-year-old combat medic who did what needed doing anyway. "You're not selling those," Roland said. She almost laughed. "Excuse me? I'm not telling you what to do." He reached into his jacket pocket and set a business card on the counter next to the coins. "I'm asking you not to. And I'm asking you to come have coffee with me next door, because Vesper hasn't moved, and in 17 years I've learned to listen to him." Her name was Elise Vander. She was 32. She had grown up in Chisholm, Minnesota, enlisted at 22 because she couldn't afford nursing school any other way, and spent 6 years as a combat medic before getting out with enough GI Bill money to finally finish her RN. She had worked the ICU at Northland Regional Medical Center for 3 years. Nights mostly, the hard ones, the cardiac and sepsis cases, the ones other nurses went home from needing a drink and a long shower. She told Roland all of this in the coffee shop, 2 doors down from the pawn shop, sitting across from him with a cup she hadn't touched, because the steam rising off it made her realize she was colder than she'd thought. Then she told him about Conrad Bird. Bird was Northland Regional's Director of Pharmacy and Compliance, a title that sounded like an administrative afterthought, but actually gave him oversight of every controlled substance that moved through the hospital. He had held the position for 11 years. He had a corner office, a good suit, and a handshake that lingered a half-second too long. She had stumbled onto it almost by accident. A patient on her floor, a man recovering from hip replacement surgery, had flagged a discrepancy on his billing statement, a medication listed as administered that he had never received. She'd gone to check the pharmacy logs and found the entry. Then she'd found another, and another. Over 3 months, she traced what looked like a systematic pattern. Medications billed to Medicare, logged as dispensed, never actually given. The dollar amounts were individually small, $40 here, $180 there, but they added up fast. She had gone to the hospital compliance office, which reported to Conrad Bird. Nothing happened. 2 weeks later, the pharmacy reported a series of missing controlled substances, oxycodone primarily. The investigation pointed to a cloned keycard, the keycard that had been used to access the pharmacy after hours, multiple times over 6 weeks, belonged to Elise Vander. She told her union rep, she told HR, she told anyone who would listen that her card had never left her possession, that she had never once taken anything that wasn't prescribed and documented, that the allegations were retaliation for what she'd reported. The nursing board opened an investigation. Her license was suspended the same day. Bird had sat in on the HR meeting where they walked her out. He'd given her a look she hadn't understood at the time, something between satisfaction and warning, and she had carried the image of it for 7 months like a stone in her shoe. Roland listened to all of it without interrupting. Vesper lay under the table, pressed against Elise's feet. When she finished, Roland turned his coffee cup in a slow circle. "You said he'd done this before. How do you know?" "A nurse I used to work with. She left Northland about 2 years before I started there. Left under a cloud," she said. "Medication discrepancy. Never got her license back." Elise shook her head. "I didn't make the connection until after." Roland nodded slowly. "Give me a week." He gave it 10 days. Those 10 days were the kind that narrowed down to their smallest units. She counted hours, and then she counted the eggs in the carton, and then she borrowed $40 from a woman at her church who didn't ask questions. She got a notice on her door that her rent was officially late. She called the property management company and asked for 2 more weeks, and the man on the phone said he would make a note of it, which she knew meant nothing. Roland called on a Thursday morning early. "Can you meet me at my office?" he said. "Bring whatever documentation you have, and don't call anyone until you get here." His office was a single room above a dry cleaner with 2 mismatched chairs and a whiteboard covered in names and dates. Vesper was in the corner on a dog bed that had seen better years. He lifted his head when she came in and set it back down. Roland had pulled the compliance records for Northland Regional going back 12 years, through a source he didn't name and didn't need to. He had also contacted the Minnesota Attorney General's Healthcare Fraud Division as of yesterday morning. Conrad Bird has done this 3 times, Rowland said. He turned to the whiteboard. Northland is the 3rd hospital. First was a smaller facility downstate. A nurse there reported billing irregularities in 2016, lost her license in 2017 after a controlled substance incident that looked exactly like yours. Second hospital was in Wisconsin, 2020. Same pattern, different nurse, same outcome. He tapped a name at the bottom of the board. The fraud total across all 3 facilities is somewhere north of $2 million, and that's a conservative estimate. Elise stared at the board. Her throat felt tight. The keycard logs, Rowland continued. I had someone look at the hardware records. The chip readings on the pharmacy door show access from your card, but the card was badged in the main lobby 12 minutes earlier. You can't be in 2 places that fast, not in a hospital that size. He paused. Someone cloned the card. Probably had access to the card reader data through the compliance system, which Bird controls. There was more. A woman named Frances Call, the former director of nursing at Northland, who had retired 14 months ago after what she'd described to Rowland as irreconcilable differences with administration, had kept her own records. Not official ones, personal ones, emails she'd printed out, notes she'd taken in meetings, a log she'd started in 2021 when she'd first noticed the pattern. She had been looking for the right moment to go to someone with the information. Rowland had given her that moment. She's already spoken with the AG's office, he said. She has documentation that Bird flagged your badge access specifically in the 2 weeks after your compliance report. He was building the setup before the substances even went missing. Elise sat down in one of the mismatched chairs. She put her hands flat on her knees. How long, she said, for the investigation? How long before anything actually happens? It's already started, Rowland said. The AG's office executed a record subpoena on Northland this morning. He looked at her steadily. You're not at the end of this, but you're past the middle. She was past the middle, and the middle was still hard. She made the rice last another week. She reached out to a nursing advocacy organization whose number was taped to the corkboard in the nursing board's waiting room. She had memorized it on the day of her hearing, thinking she would never need it, and then had needed it badly. They connected her with a legal clinic that took healthcare worker retaliation cases pro bono. The attorney assigned to her case, a meticulous woman named Gail who wore the same blue blazer to every meeting, filed a formal retaliation complaint with the EEOC within 48 hours of their first conversation. 3 weeks after Rowland's call, Conrad Bird was placed on administrative leave by Northland Regional's board of directors, pending an internal review that everyone involved understood was no longer internal in any meaningful sense. 3 weeks after that, he was arrested. The federal charges covered Medicare fraud, healthcare fraud, conspiracy, identity fraud in connection with the cloned keycards, and obstruction of a state nursing board proceeding. The total figure the U.S. Attorney's Office cited in the indictment was $2.3 million, over 11 years, across 3 hospitals, targeting 4 nurses who had filed compliance reports. 4 nurses. Elise had not been the first. She had not even been the second or third. She read the indictment on her phone, sitting in her car in a parking lot, because she needed somewhere quiet. The charge that stopped her, the one she read 3 times, was the last one on the list: obstruction of a state nursing board proceeding. Someone had read what she'd said, had believed it enough to build a case around it, had named what had been done to her in the language of federal law. She sat in the car for a long time. The Minnesota Board of Nursing reinstated her license 6 weeks after the arrest, with a formal letter acknowledging that the evidence submitted had demonstrated the suspension was the result of a deliberately engineered false report. The letter used careful, official language, but Elise had been in enough institutional settings to read between the lines. What it said, stripped of its formality, was, "We know what happened to you, and we're sorry it took this long." Northland Regional's CEO called her personally, a stiff, uncomfortable call that she had the grace not to make any harder than it needed to be. He apologized formally, the kind of apology that comes with a legal team on the other line. He offered her back pay for the 7 months she had been out of work. He said the hospital was committed to rebuilding trust with its nursing staff and that a full internal audit would be conducted. She accepted all of it. Gail negotiated the settlement. It covered the 7 months of lost salary, the legal fees, and a figure listed under compensatory damages for reputational harm. Elise didn't let herself look at the total until it landed in her account because she had learned by then that things weren't real until they were real. It was real. She paid 3 months of rent in advance. She went to the grocery store on a Sunday afternoon and filled the cart all the way to the top. The kind of cart she hadn't pushed in almost a year, and stood in the checkout line with something she couldn't quite name lodged behind her sternum. Not quite happiness. Something older and quieter. Something that knew it had survived what it wasn't guaranteed to survive. She went back to Northland on a Tuesday in March, first shift of the week. The unit was short-staffed, as it always was. There were 4 patients in critical status, a physician who hadn't slept in 19 hours, and 2 nursing assistants running at capacity. She put on her badge and her scrubs and walked into the ICU and felt the particular clarity she had missed more than she'd let herself admit. The way a room full of monitors and medication pumps and too much urgency sharpens everything down to exactly what matters. She didn't tell anyone what had happened. Some of them already knew. The ones who didn't would figure it out eventually, or they wouldn't. It didn't change the fact that there was a patient in bed 3 whose blood pressure was trending the wrong direction and needed someone paying attention. She paid attention. Roland brought Vesper by the hospital 2 months later, on a Saturday when Elise was just coming off nights. She was standing in the parking garage, keys in her hand, too tired to drive but too wired to sleep, when she heard the click of the dog's nails on the concrete. She looked up. Vesper was already moving toward her. He stopped when he reached her and pressed the top of his broad head against her knee. She put her hand on him and stood there for a moment in the ugly fluorescent light of the parking garage at 6:30 in the morning and let herself feel the weight of it, not the 7 months, not the arrest, not the number on the settlement paperwork. Just this. The dog and the concrete, and the fact that she was standing in a parking garage with her badge still on because she'd just come off a shift, which meant she still had a badge to wear. "He wanted to come see you," Roland said. He was standing a few feet back with his hands in his jacket pockets. "He's been restless." "I thought dogs were supposed to be good at compartmentalizing." "Most of them," he shrugged, Vesper's particular. She scratched behind the dog's ears. He leaned into it, eyes half closing. "The other 3 nurses," she said, "the ones from the other hospitals. Do you know what happened to them? 2 of them got their licenses back once the federal case broke. The third, the first one from 2016, she never went back to nursing. She runs a daycare now." Roland paused. She testified at the grand jury. She'd been waiting for someone to call her for 8 years. Elise thought about that. 8 years of waiting. 8 years of a cloned keycard and a compliance report, and a man in a good suit who had decided she was expendable. 8 years of knowing exactly what had happened and having nowhere to take it. 7 months had felt like a long time. She tried to imagine 8. "The system didn't fix itself," she said. "It wasn't a complaint, just an observation she'd been turning over since the night the indictment came through." "No," Roland said, "it didn't." Frances Call had called her once, after the arrest, in the evening. A short call. She'd said, "I kept those notes for 3 years, and I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't know who to give them to. I'm sorry it took so long. I kept hoping someone else would fix it first." Elise had told her she understood. She did. She had spent 7 months hoping the same thing. What she hadn't said, what she had thought about many times since, was that Frances Call had kept those notes for 3 years instead of shredding them, which was not nothing. That was its own kind of courage, the courage of someone who didn't know if anything would ever come of what they were holding on to, but held on anyway, just in case. Just because the right thing to do when you know the truth is to refuse to let it go. Like a dog with its paws on a glass counter, refusing to move until someone asked the right question. "He's staying with you?" she asked. "He's retired," Roland said. "He's not going anywhere." She looked at Vesper again. Her medallion was in a box in her apartment now, on the shelf above her desk, next to a photograph of her unit taken at Bagram in the fall of 2019. She had bought herself a decent frame for it. She had earned it twice over, she knew that now. Not just once on a hillside in November, but again across 7 months of $83 balances and late notices and a compliance report that someone had tried very hard to make disappear. The V stood for valor. It stood for the Hill in November, and the 6 years in uniform, and the 3 years in the ICU, and the 7 months of rice and peanut butter, and a man who had believed she could be erased, and had been wrong. Who was, as of last week, awaiting trial in a federal courthouse in Minneapolis with a $500,000 bond he couldn't meet. She said goodbye to Roland and Vesper in the parking garage and drove home in the pale morning light, the city still quiet, Lake Superior just visible at the edge of the highway, flat and silver, and enormous the way it always was. The kind of enormous that made everything that had happened feel small by comparison, and then made it feel exactly the right size. She went upstairs, she slept. When she woke up, she went back to work.